Hey folks, so I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment, and I'm with my friend George Earhart. And
Greetings.
folks will have seen that I did an interview on the radio about the Space Force that Donald Trump has started. And apparently, that interview touched a nerve. My friend George actually has some thoughts. This is George Earhart, my longtime friend. He has some thoughts about the Space Force, so I figured we'd let him start this conversation as we take this Space Force chat to the next level.
I mean, this, if you try to see the big picture, is some really effed up stuff. America is at that pivotal moment. Will we become something worth keeping, or will the empire, crash and burn? And here comes an orange man ripping off what I thought was culturally it would be a front to his masculinity, a kind of effeminate science fiction show, Star Trek, stealing the logo, nakedly stealing the logo, embarrassing us before the whole cosmos with his ridiculous Space Force that I don't know if there'll ever be a ship built for. I'm not sure. This is not that simulacrum thing that postmodern guy talked about, and the Space Force will be like a Disney World attraction and not actually an armed service thing of any kind. And it's really bad, and I kind of thinking along the lines theme song, like soaring above the drug addiction and poverty of Appalachia, the Space Force, where you can get a paycheck, wear a hat like Captain Crunch, fight the dreaded insert name of enemy here. America failing in space, failing below, the Space Force. The hollowest thing ever. Loser country.
Bum, bum, bum.
Yes, it's bad.
Well, when you think about the Space Force, a few things come to mind, but I did envision that, 13, 14-year-old kid who's really into Star Wars and Star Trek, and he's at school, and now in school, I don't know if folks recall this, but they make you do all kinds of, what I'm going to do when I grow up activities where you take tests and they tell you what job you're most likely to take, and you have to sit down with a school guidance counselor and make a career pathway plan, and it's all very, very silly, right? Some people have life goals, some don't, but they try to impose this and get kids thinking about their future. And I imagine there's some kid who has no goals in his future or whatever, and then he sees that announcement. Donald Trump has started the Space Force. And he goes, cool! And he orders his Make America Great Again cap on the internet that day. He goes into the guidance counselor. The guidance counselor says, what are you going to do when you grow up? He says, Space Force! And it's a real thing. The guidance counselor can't say, well, have you considered being an electrician? The guidance counselor now has to say, yes, you could be in the Space Force, because now there is actually a Space Force that this kid could join. It is now the sixth branch of the U.S. military, the Space Force. And so, little Johnny, who wants to grow up to be an outer space fighting action hero, the guidance counselor is not allowed to say to him, come up with some real career aspirations. Now she has to kind of play along. I think that's one of the weirder aspects of this. Would you say? Would you agree? Am I onto something?
I would agree, and I would make it personal. As much as I think it's a crock of shit, I feel like my career as a bartender is a setting sun, and maybe it's not. Where psychologically I'm good at it, and I keep going. But maybe, I have fantasies about maybe I want to be in the Space Force because, like I said, I can get a check. I'm not transgender. I don't know. I think Trump wouldn't let someone transgender in the Space Force. I'm not sure about the guidelines. I can be in the Space Force. I just kind of have an image of myself with Flight of the Valkyrie blasting on the speakers. My co-pilot is a pug dog, and I, just crashing into the moon in my atomic destroyer, and just thinking if a Borg cube or some kind of alien did come at that very moment to destroy us, Trump is a genius. History will validate him. It's it's a check. America is about getting a check at this point, and if Yang can't get me that extra money because Sanders is more popular, what am I going to do?
There you go. I'm perplexed by the whole thing. The fact that he called out Russia and China in the announcement, the fact that it is specifically not a wing of NASA. It's not about science research, space research. But instead, it absolutely, positively, specifically is a military operation. So much is wrong with this, I don't know where to begin. And again, I don't see Russia and China militarizing outer space. So why are we? The whole thing is just weird. I wonder if it's like, and you raised this, I think, in a conversation we had. Is this like a government program, a wing of the U.S. military that they've announced that never actually gets created? It's just kind of like a TV special that Donald Trump is having?
Baudrillard, I forget, like one of those French guys who writes garbage, like the simulacrum. He talked about, like, it's kind of like Disney World has that place where you can visit everywhere in the world in a simulacrum. And in some way, this is not going to serve that function, but in some way, it's like, and people, like more people have their idea of space, I've heard it said, from Star Trek than from NASA. So, like, what it takes to, like, if in some way this garbage could have feed half the world's children with this monstrosity. Mm-hmm. In some way, if it fills that ignorant, sick psychological need that people have acquired, that it is their Star Trek, it is their mythos, this hunk of crap in this failing country, it could get over in this sick way before it all comes crashing down.
And they don't have to actually do anything. It's just like they get credit for hypothetically, in theory, declaring that we at some point are going to do something, and then they don't have to actually do it? Is that what you're getting at? Like,
I mean, didn't NASA, he was a terrible human being, but I got the feeling after that Nazi died, that von Braun guy, everything went downhill. That thing blew up with the school teacher on it. Like, everything just started not to work, and it's like it's a mess, and they're gonna, we're gonna put like all this. What kind of weapons are these things going to have? What kind of fuel source? What if they blow up in the atmosphere? It's just everything about it is. If you actually had a battle in space, what would actually happen with the debris? And I have questions like if they come crash. It's the whole thing is a mess. But I guess people can't think, or it's going to come to maybe it's not going to work, and they'll say the Russians sabotaged our space force. Like, we could have had an awesome space force, but the Russians technologically sabotaged us, and Rachel Maddow will go nuts. I think that's possible. Like, we failed, but we didn't really fail because America never fails, no matter how much we fail, and we all know we fail.
Well, it's interesting because right before JFK was killed, he spoke at the UN, and he proposed making the mission to the moon a joint mission with the Soviet Union. And can you imagine how history would be different if on the vessel that landed on the moon, there had not just been Americans, but there had also been Russians. And they had landed on the moon together, and it was like a joint achievement. I think that would be tremendous.
That's real Star Trek. That's the real...
Well, right. And then the other thing is, I think it's kind of amusing, is, JFK was killed, but his brother, his younger or older brother, RFK?
He was younger, I believe.
Younger, right. RFK, when he was running for president, before he was also gunned down by Sirhan, apparently the song that he selected to be his campaign song, it was his favorite song, was the song To Dream the Impossible Dream from the Broadway musical Man of La Mancha, right? And he loved it, right? And that was a very popular song in the early 60s, right? To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to go where the brave dare not go, and there's a line, what is it? To fight for what's right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And then the last line in the song, right, is what is it? To reach the unreachable star, right? And then it had implications about the space program. The space program, a lot of people are pessimistic about it. A lot of people are cynical about it. People feel like in 1969, people have gone as far as to say the moon landing was staged because so many people were demoralized about America, and they staged this thing to make everyone be full of patriotism. But in reality, the space program, in a way, it kind of, incarnated coming out of the Roosevelt era. This feeling that we were going to be the best in science, the best in math, and that science and technological progress would lead to world peace. and cooperation, and really a lot of what you hear coming out of Russia and China now seems to reflect those kind of ideals, like the Roosevelt administration before the Cold War began, right? And the final years of World War II, you read the Tehran Accords, the very famous Tehran Accords, and there was this feeling that we're going to work together, we're going to have scientific progress, and together we're going to reach the unreachable star. And it was odd because it had the socialist Marxist viewpoint of like Russia and China, but it also had that American go get 'em, work hard, achieve your dreams, that kind of thing in it too. You know what I'm saying? And it was this odd, the World War II mentality that they talk about, right? If you read the statements of the Allies during World War II, you read Roosevelt's speeches, to the country during World War II, it's an odd mishmash of like Marxism, American patriotism, Protestant work ethic, it's the space program was kind of the only part of that really survived as the Cold War got going. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I think you're onto something in that, like, I think there's a residual of that, and we're getting a pretty ugly setup where there are people who are giving, like, I see there's like some kind of company that has advertisements in the subway. It's about it has the aesthetic of like an H.G. Wells kind of future,
Yeah.
and all the technology doesn't work, and it's like 2020 did not pan out, but our insurance company or whatever it is pretty good. It's kind of a joke that people have given up on that. So it's kind of like Trump in a way that he knows how to kind of cherry pick demographics or groups of people, or might tap into some kind of feeling in some subpopulation. That's like there's some people who still want that, but it's ending up in his idiocracy genre. The future, like I'm not like the Democrats or this or that. I'm going to be a part of this idea that's futuristic, but it's idiocracy.
Right. And then the other thing, though, when you talk about space stuff, the term flying saucer, right, that became a popular term in, I believe, 1947, very beginning of the Cold War. And it was, people started citing UFOs, and that became a thing. And of course, sci-fi movies picked up on it. And, there was even a gospel song, a gospel bluegrass country song. You better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers, could be the coming of the judgment day. There's a sign, there's no doubt that there's trouble that's about. If you see them in the sky, you better pray. And it was like there was this weird, like, apocalyptic association that came with the flying saucers. And it was almost like, it was like a feeling that coming out of World War II, World War II is so horrendous. So many people died. I mean, and it was just a horrendous event. And that coming out of it, when America had this massively high living standard, the highest living standard in the world at that point, the 1950s, the booming economy of the United States, the post-war economic boom, the USA is selling steel and cars to the whole world, and I mean, workers' wages are vastly increasing. You have the post-war strike wave, and all of a sudden the UAW, those auto workers are making huge amounts of money, and steel workers, and all of this is happening. But there's still this trauma in the American mind. And that's why, like, the movies of that time period, you see so many movies about, like, Godzilla, like, attacking a city, or the giant insect, crawling over New York City or something like that. And, this whole flying saucer craze, and the belief that the flying saucers were a sign of the apocalypse. And it's like people just couldn't accept, that things were safe now. There had been so much pain in the Great Depression. There'd been so much horrendous stuff that had gone on during the war, and people were, all of a sudden, they're in the American dream. And it's like, this can't be real.
That's a kind of a thing about the 50s. I kind of got a feeling that the American dream had to have like a shadow self of the American nightmare, because it's like you don't go through that kind of trauma, the Depression, the war, even if you're not touched the most profoundly by it, and not, I think, somewhere in your psyche have the idea that surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. At least Godot has got to come. Mm-hmm. I'm in this box in the suburbs, and I have things people that I knew as a child would have thought miraculous. But there has to be something to life, and I knew greater fear than this, and I will know it again. Yeah. I think that has to be a part of the psyche.
Well, and then what's weird is that, like, I think it was really like starting in like the 70s and 80s, there became this kind of belief that like the 60s ruined the 1950s, right? and that the 1950s, that's what America is all about. And the 1950s was one decade. Never before had America been that rich, and it's never been that rich ever since. And yet, the propaganda that a lot of conservatives have is that that's what all of American history was, this glorious white picket fence, booming economy, patriotism, locking communists in jail, traditional family, and it was like the 50s became this idealized memory that you talk to. I mean, a lot of people even now, still have in their minds that somehow all of American history was the 1950s until those darn hippies in the 60s showed up and ruined everything. And that's just not accurate. But even in the 1950s, while they're living this kind of, very high standard of living, the American dream and all of that, they're haunted, right? There's ghosts, what I mean? There's even like a knowledge that somehow, what they have is not real. It's kind of almost an illusion, and it's cursed, and they're not safe, and McCarthyism and the fear, and that at one point, the ruling class of the United States stopped it, right? They, after Stalin died, after the Rosenbergs were executed, they censured Joe McCarthy. He went off and drank himself to death. The American media was telling people to cool it with this McCarthyism. But there was a layer of the American middle class, like doctors and lawyers and people that eventually became like the John Birch Society, that wouldn't stop, even though mainstream, sure, McCarthyism had been whipped up from the highest levels of U.S. society, but it stopped. And then there was a section of the U.S. Population, the middle class, that was still in this apocalyptic mindset that just couldn't accept things and was terrified and kept going with it. It's really fascinating to think about. You want to talk about pessimism, right? Some of that pessimism, and then the left pessimism shows up later, and that's a whole thing. But it's very weird. In this Space Force, you can see a pessimistic mindset. It's like, oh, China's going to space. They're getting their helium-3, there's fusion energy. Well, we got to build a military thing because we got to fight them because there's going to be a big apocalyptic war in space. I mean, it's like we take what could be a potentially good situation, and with our internal trauma and fear and our military-industrial complex and our belief that everyone's a liar and everyone's a huckster and everyone's a con man, you know what it's a lot like? It's a lot like the Twilight Zone episode, the very famous Twilight Zone episode that I've referenced many times, where the space aliens come down from outer space. And they're giving everyone health care, and they're giving us new technology and all of that. And they ask them, why are you doing it? And they show them this book they have that's called To Serve Man. To Serve Man. And it's really great, and everyone loves the space aliens. They're doing this and all of a sudden. But then they're going to take some people back to the home planet. And this one woman, as the spaceship is blasting off, it's running to the people, trying to get them to not go on the ship because she's holding the To Serve Man book. And she shouts, "It's a cookbook! It's a cookbook!" And it's like it always has to be a cookbook. Nothing good can ever happen. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you probably met people like that. That, like, they could win the lottery and they'd be like, God damn it, I won the lottery. I knew they were trying to put something over. It's like they can never really, that's someone who's been traumatized. They can never really accept anything good happening.
Once traumatized, always traumatized. That's what we're getting at. Just the thing is, like, if you're talking about the 50s, it's just, they had it was a little less science fiction, the kind of modern luxuries people had. But, I mean, just any normal human being, I think, if you see, and not just the war, many people, there's scholarship, many people died in the Depression who would have not otherwise. That's understated from my understanding. But to see young men devoured by the hungry guns, to see bombs burn, find the body of a little girl, wrong side of the war, burnt up, to find these things. I mean, the ray gun or the teleporter is not going to come. You're going to be a different person after that. Mm-hmm. And so that trauma is just a part of the fabric of reality. And trauma, Americans, in a way, they're optimistic that they deny that. And you see Americans in general have a hard time dealing with trauma, in my estimation.
Yeah.
They don't accept it as a part of life, or once it's there, it's not going.
Yeah, and I mean, the Ayn Rand stuff and really the Trump White House, the cynicism and all of that, and I mean, now the Space Force, rather than being excited and wanting to collaborate with Russia and China in space. I mean, it all kind of fits kind of the tragedy of America, right? I mean, it's this kind of tragic mindset that we are radical individualists, and The American dream, was largely, we know that there's a lot of ugly things behind it. And I think that rather than seeing the American dream debunked, right, when people came to terms with the fact that, genocide of Native Americans, slavery, Korea, Vietnam, that the American dream was not achieved, greatness, and the United States wealth wasn't acquired through the USA just being Mr. Nice Guy around the world and doing everything more efficiently. That okay, we've debunked that, but that doesn't mean that there is no truth. That doesn't mean that nothing in the world can be true. That doesn't mean that every ideology, every belief system, everything that gives people a reason to wake up in the morning is fake. But I think that that's the conclusion a lot of Americans have come to. The American dream was fake in a lot of ways. There was a lot of deception there and all that. So based on that, everything must be fake, right? And that this kind of reflects that. And so it's like everything's a hustle, everything's a scam. The Space Force sounds nice, so and everything is phony. Everything has a fake character to it. Everything is a cheap Hollywood movie. Everyone's trying to put something over on everybody else. It's tragic. It reflects the mindset of the times. I think the Space Force is a hustle, honestly. It's a hustle. It's appealing to cynicism. It's appealing to adolescent half-baked desires. You talk to a teenage boy who wants to be in outer space or wants to be a professional football player. The more you talk to them, you realize they don't really have a plan. They don't really have any illusion they're ever going to do that. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I meet a lot of young men that have the muscle, but they're not kshatriya of the Sanskrit. They're not really warriors. Lots of young men that look like, oh, that guy looks like a warrior in a movie. He is not. He's nothing even close to a warrior. It's not happening.
Making kind of science fiction-y or unrealistic life goals is a way to avoid having a conversation about making real life goals that are actually achievable and figuring out how you can rearrange things in your life to actually achieve them. But if you make no life goals, you can kind of cover that up by making stupid life goals.
In a way, Trump is the spiritual embodiment of this whole thing. He's the perfect president for that. The biggest cons this guy can do are the ones that a lot of Americans want him to. A lot of Americans want to be violated by this man psychically, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Not all, but it seems like a mighty big chunk are just looking like, Trump, have your way with me. Lead my country into ruin. Not the Democrats are a bargain, far from it. But, just take my grandchildren's future and make it into something that's going to be so regrettable and so shameful. In China, they're going to be doing things we're going to look at like, wow, but we're going to still have to say we're number one. Number one will really mean we're 114th, but it still doesn't matter. We're going to still chant that in the theaters. We're going to still have, the ships are probably going to get worse. The fighter jets and they're going to crash on the people in the crowd, and the ones surviving will still chant we're number one, because we cannot swallow the ego we have, appreciate that if you look at the number of events in American history, how many of them, let's face it, we have been the bad guy. Not all, but we've been the bad guy. You can make a list, and it's a pretty long list, and we need to humble ourselves now, or we will destroy ourselves. And I don't know if maybe people can grow up quick. In an individual's life, it happens. Maybe the country can grow up. I don't know.
Well, on that note, we'll conclude.